On the morning of March 9, 1945, Private First Class Robert Dunham crouched behind a volcanic rock outcrop on Iwo Jima, watching orange flame pour from the mouth of a cave 200 yards ahead. The flame wasn't coming from his portable M2O-2 flamethrower, which sat empty and useless on the ash beside him. The fire streaming into that Japanese position was coming from a Sherman tank, and it was reaching farther than anything Dunham had ever seen a flamethrower project. 150 yards of burning napalm, arcing through the morning air like liquid hell, flowing into cave mouths that his 40-yard portable unit couldn't touch. Dunham had landed on Iwo Jima on February 19th, D-Day, carrying 68 pounds of pressurized fuel on his back. He was 20 years old, a farm kid from Nebraska who joined the Marines in 1943 because it seemed like the right thing to do. The recruiter never mentioned flamethrowers. Nobody mentioned that he'd be carrying equipment that made him the highest priority target on any battlefield, or that his weapon's bright orange flame would mark his exact position for every Japanese soldier within sight. They certainly never mentioned that most flamethrower operators who were hit didn't just get wounded, they died. 3 weeks into the Iwo Jima campaign, Dunham was one of the few portable flamethrower operators still alive in his battalion. The others were casualties, killed by sniper fire or machine gun bursts while trying to close within 40 yards of enemy positions. The M2O-2 flamethrower was a remarkable improvement over earlier models. It actually worked when you pulled the trigger, unlike the M1, which had failed so catastrophically at Buna in 1942 that infantry lost confidence in the weapon entirely. But working reliably didn't solve the fundamental tactical problem. To use a portable flamethrower, you had to get close. Very close. And getting close meant crossing open ground under fire while carrying highly visible equipment that screamed, "Shoot me first!" If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Sherman flame tank that Dunham was watching had no such limitations. It was an M4, a 3R5, though the Marines who used it simply called it the Zippo, or the Mark I. The tank's armor was 3 inches thick on the front. Japanese machine gun fire bounced off harmlessly. The flamethrower, replacing the tank's 75mm main gun, could project burning napalm 150 yards, nearly 4 times the range of Dunham's portable unit, and the tank carried 300 gallons of fuel, compared to the 4 gallons in his backpack tanks. Where Dunham's weapon could fire for 8 to 9 seconds before running empty, the flame tank could engage targets for minutes at a time. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. When the flame tank opened up on that cave position, Japanese defenders, who had withstood 3 days of naval bombardment, who had held their positions through artillery barrages and infantry assaults, evacuated within seconds. Dunham watched them emerge from a rear entrance, running into Marine rifle fire rather than face the flames pouring through their primary opening. The fear wasn't about the physical effects of burning, though those were horrific enough. The fear was primal, instinctive, older than training or discipline or duty. Fire consumed oxygen in enclosed spaces. Fire filled caves with heat and toxic gases. Fire gave you seconds to decide between burning alive inside or running into bullets outside. Both choices led to death, but the human brain, faced with imminent incineration, chose the quick death over the slow one every single time. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent 8 months preparing Iwo Jima's defenses. He'd carved 11 miles of tunnels into the volcanic rock, connecting hundreds of fortified positions. He'd reinforced bunkers with steel plate and coconut logs, covered them with 3 feet of volcanic ash and soil, positioned weapons to provide interlocking fields of fire across every avenue of approach. His strategy depended on Japanese troops holding their fortified positions, inflicting maximum casualties, forcing the Americans to fight for weeks to secure the island. The strategy was working, until the flame tanks appeared. Kuribayashi had no effective counter to the weapon. Japanese doctrine didn't include specific tactics for dealing with armored flamethrowers. The defensive positions that protected his troops from artillery and bombing made them vulnerable to fire. Enclosed spaces that provided safety from bullets became death traps when filled with flame. Kuribayashi ordered his troops to target flame tank operators on site, to prioritize them as high-value targets, but the operators were safe inside 3 inches of armor. Japanese anti-tank guns had to score direct hits on vulnerable spots to disable the tanks, and even then, the crews usually survived. The development of American flame tanks had been slow at first. The Marine Corps had initially left flamethrower tank development to the Army, placing orders for just 9 tanks per division, but combat experience in the Marshall Islands and Marianas demonstrated the desperate need for armored flamethrower support. Portable flamethrower operators were dying at catastrophic rates. One Marine Battalion's portable flame unit sustained a casualty rate of 92% during the Iwo Jima campaign, leaving few troops trained to use the weapon. At Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, a top-secret unit called the Flamethrower Group began converting M4A3 Sherman medium tanks into flame weapons. The work was done by Navy Seabees under the direction of Colonel Unmacht. The Seabees combined elements from 3 different flame unit designs: the Canadian Ronson system, the Navy Mark I, and an improved Navy design. The result was the CBH-1 flamethrower system, quickly superseded by the even better CBH-2. Installing a flamethrower system in a Sherman tank was complex, painstaking work. It required 150 pounds of welding rod and 1,100 electrical connections per vehicle. The cost ran between $20,000 and $25,000 per tank, equivalent to nearly $300,000 in modern currency, but the results were worth every penny and every hour of labor. The flamethrower replaced the Sherman's 75mm main gun. It operated on 300 pounds per square inch of pressure, the same as the portable M2-2. But where the portable unit held 4 gallons of fuel, the flame tank carried 300 gallons. Where the portable unit could fire for 9 seconds, the flame tank could fire continuously for much longer engagements. And where the portable unit had a maximum range of 40 yards, the flame tank could project burning napalm 150 yards or more, depending on wind conditions and fuel mixture. The weapon could traverse 270 degrees while firing, allowing the tank to engage multiple targets without repositioning. The fuel was napalm thickened, meaning it burned hotter and stuck to targets better than earlier gasoline mixtures. When that flame hit the entrance of a cave or pillbox, it didn't just burn at the opening, it flowed inside like liquid, following the contours of the space, spreading across walls and ceiling, consuming everything it touched. 8 flame tanks were shipped to Iwo Jima for Operation Detachment. They landed on D-Day, February 19, 1945, but didn't go into action immediately. The Marine commanders wanted to assess the tactical situation first, determine where the tanks would be most effective, ensure they understood the terrain and enemy positions. When the flame tanks finally moved forward to support infantry assaults on February 21st, D+2, the effect was immediate and obvious. Japanese positions that had withstood repeated infantry assaults, artillery barrages, and conventional tank fire would be cleared within minutes when a flame tank appeared. The Marines quickly learned that a single flame tank could accomplish what an entire infantry company might spend hours trying to achieve with conventional weapons. The flame tanks approached Japanese positions with what looked like impunity. Machine gun fire that would cut down infantry sparked harmlessly off the armor. The defenders couldn't stop the tanks from reaching effective range. Then the tanks would fire. 300 gallons of burning napalm would splash across fortified positions, flowing into bunkers and cave entrances, consuming everything the flame touched. Japanese defenders who had remained in positions through conventional tank attacks would evacuate when flame tanks appeared. The Marines quickly learned that bringing up a flame tank would often clear an entire defensive complex without direct infantry assault. The defenders would retreat through their tunnel systems rather than face the fire. Reports from Marine units across the island documented the extraordinary effectiveness. Battalion and regimental commanders began requesting flame tank support by name, calling for them specifically rather than conventional armor or artillery. The tanks became the most requested support weapon on Iwo Jima, surpassing even artillery in terms of how often infantry units called for them. Infantry units would sometimes halt their advance and wait for flame tank support rather than attempt to clear fortified positions with conventional weapons and accept the resulting casualties. The flame tanks were so valuable, so critical to breaking the Japanese defensive network, that they were pooled among divisions rather than permanently assigned to specific units. Only 4 flame tanks were allocated to each tank battalion, and with 3 Marine divisions on the island, that meant just 12 flame tanks total for the entire operation. To maximize their effectiveness, the tanks were dispatched from central refueling points to wherever they were most urgently needed. A flame tank might support the 4th Marine Division in the morning, then move to support the 5th Marine Division in the afternoon, then shift to 3rd Division positions by evening. The dependency on flame tanks revealed something important about the nature of the battle. Iwo Jima wasn't a war of maneuver. It was a war of fortifications. The Japanese had spent 8 months preparing defenses in depth. They'd dug those 11 miles of tunnels connecting hundreds of fortified positions. They'd reinforced bunkers with materials that could withstand direct hits from naval shells. They'd positioned weapons to provide interlocking fields of fire. They'd created a defensive system specifically designed to survive American firepower superiority. Artillery couldn't destroy the positions. The shells would explode against reinforced concrete without penetrating. Aerial bombing couldn't reach defenders deep in tunnels. Naval gunfire, even from battleships firing 14-inch and 16-inch shells, couldn't collapse the cave systems. The Americans needed a weapon that could kill defenders inside fortifications without exposing American infantry to sustained fire at close range. The flame tank was that weapon. But the flame tank's effectiveness wasn't just about physical destruction. It was about psychology. The weapon exploited a fundamental human fear that transcended training and discipline. Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima had proven they could withstand conventional weapons. They'd held their positions through the most intensive naval bombardment in Pacific War history, 72 consecutive days of bombing and shelling before the invasion even began. They'd endured 3 more days of preparatory fire before Marines landed. They'd faced artillery, tanks, rifle fire, grenades, explosives. They'd held their positions through all of it because their fortifications protected them. They felt relatively safe inside their pillboxes and caves. Then the flamethrowers appeared, and safety became an illusion. Fire didn't respect concrete walls or ventilation systems. Fire consumed oxygen. Fire filled enclosed spaces. Fire found every crack and opening. When a flame tank operator fired into a cave entrance, the defenders had seconds to decide their fate: stay inside and burn, or exit through the rear entrance and face American rifle fire. Most chose to run. Some chose to fight from inside as long as possible. Very few survived either choice. The fear of fire is primal. Humans evolved alongside fire for hundreds of thousands of years. We learned to use it, to control it, to fear it. That fear lives in the oldest parts of the human brain, the parts that react before conscious thought can intervene. Every soldier can be trained to accept the possibility of being shot or blown up. Battle-hardened veterans can stand their ground under artillery fire, can hold positions under direct assault, can maintain discipline when comrades fall beside them. But no amount of training can eliminate the instinctive terror of burning alive. Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima understood this truth the moment flame tanks entered the battle. They'd been trained to fight to the death, to hold their positions regardless of casualties, to never surrender under any circumstances. Those orders didn't account for weapons that turned fortifications into furnaces. When napalm-thickened flame poured through cave entrances, when the temperature inside rose past the point where human skin could tolerate it, when oxygen levels dropped and toxic gases from burning fuel filled the air, training meant nothing. Instinct took over, and instinct said get out, accept any risk rather than burn alive. Private First Class Dunham witnessed this psychological collapse repeatedly during those 3 weeks on Iwo Jima. He'd watched Japanese soldiers emerge from positions that conventional weapons couldn't touch, running directly into American fire rather than remain inside caves that flame tanks were attacking. Some of them were screaming as they ran, their uniforms smouldering, their weapons abandoned. Some tried to fight, firing at Marines even as flames consumed their clothing. Most just ran, seeking any escape from the fire, choosing the quick death of bullets over the slow agony of burning. The portable flamethrower that Dunham carried produced similar psychological effects, but on a smaller scale and at much greater risk to the operator. The M-2 -2 weighed 68 pounds when fully loaded. It consisted of 3 tanks mounted on a backpack frame. 2 outer tanks held the fuel, 4 gallons total of thickened diesel mixed with gasoline. The center tank held compressed nitrogen at operating pressures between 300 and 350 pounds per square inch. The nitrogen was stored at much higher pressure, up to 2,100 pounds per square inch, then regulated down for use. The weapon could fire for 8 to 9 seconds continuously, projecting flame 20 to 40 yards depending on the fuel mixture and whether napalm thickener had been added. It was a significant improvement over the M1 and M1A1, models that had plagued earlier campaigns with ignition failures and fuel mixture problems. The M1 had been notoriously unreliable. Its ignition system depended on hydrogen being ignited by a battery-powered spark. Moisture would short out the electrical system. The hydrogen cylinders would fail. Operators would find themselves standing in front of enemy positions with weapons that wouldn't fire. On Buna in New Guinea in December 1942, M1 flamethrowers had failed so consistently that infantry lost confidence in the weapon entirely. Units assigned flamethrower support would often refuse to include the operators in their assault plans, preferring to attack without flamethrowers rather than depend on weapons that might not work. The M1A1, introduced in 1943, addressed some issues by adding napalm thickener to increase range and adding a cartridge ignition system, but reliability remained problematic. The M2-2, standardized in February 1944, finally gave American forces a dependable flame weapon. The ignition system used a spring-loaded pin to puncture a chemical cartridge, producing an 8-second flame that ignited the fuel as it sprayed from the nozzle. The system worked even in humid tropical conditions where earlier electrical ignition systems failed. The napalm-thickened fuel burned hotter and stuck to targets better than earlier gasoline mixtures. The weapon could reliably project flame 40 yards, double the effective range of the M1. By the time of the Iwo Jima operation, approximately 24,600 M2-2 units had been produced and distributed to Army and Marine Corps units throughout the Pacific. But the weapon still had fundamental tactical vulnerabilities that no amount of engineering could solve. The operator had to close to within 40 yards of enemy positions. That meant crossing open ground under fire, while carrying highly visible equipment. The operator had to stand exposed for the entire 8 to 9 second duration of each burst, and the bright orange flame with its distinctive black smoke marked the operator's exact position for every Japanese soldier within sight. Flamethrower operators became the highest priority targets on the battlefield, more so even than officers or radio operators. Japanese snipers and machine gunners learned to identify these high-value targets and concentrate fire on them. The operators wore the same uniforms as other Marines, carried the same weapons when their flamethrowers were empty. But the tanks on their backs, the distinctive shape of the flame gun, the fuel hoses connecting the components, all of these marked them as flamethrower operators even before they fired their weapons. Once they did fire, their position became known to every enemy soldier who could see the flame or its smoke. The orange fire was visible for hundreds of yards. The black smoke from burning diesel rose straight up, marking the operator's location like a beacon. Japanese gunners would concentrate fire on that smoke, knowing the flamethrower operator was somewhere beneath it. Even if they couldn't see the operator directly, they could aim at the smoke and hit the general area, hoping to catch the operator during his attack or withdrawal. American doctrine addressed the vulnerability by assigning 4 riflemen to provide covering fire for each flamethrower operator. The covering team's mission was straightforward: suppress enemy fire during the operator's approach, provide security during the actual flame attack, and cover the withdrawal back to friendly lines. But doctrine assumed the covering riflemen would survive long enough to provide that cover. On Iwo Jima, that assumption often proved catastrophically wrong. Japanese defenders quickly learned to identify flamethrower teams and concentrate overwhelming fire on them. Machine gunners would wait until the team was committed to the attack, then open fire from multiple positions simultaneously. The covering riflemen, exposed in the open while providing suppressive fire, were as vulnerable as the operator they were protecting. Many flamethrower teams were wiped out entirely, operator and covering riflemen killed before they could reach effective range of their target. The average time a portable flamethrower team remained effective in combat was measured in minutes, not hours. On Iwo Jima, where Japanese defensive positions provided excellent observation and interlocking fields of fire, that time was even shorter. Some operators were killed on their first mission. Others survived multiple attacks through a combination of skill, luck, and the courage of their covering teams. But the casualty rate among portable flamethrower operators and their covering riflemen was among the highest of any specialty in the Marine Corps. This is why the flame tanks were so valuable, so desperately needed, so effective at breaking Japanese resistance. The tanks solved the vulnerability problem that killed portable flamethrower operators. The crew was safe inside armor that Japanese small arms couldn't penetrate. The tanks could close to within effective range without exposing personnel to direct fire. The longer range meant the tanks could engage targets from positions that provided some cover and concealment. And the massive fuel capacity meant the tanks could continue operations for extended periods without needing to withdraw for refueling. Private First Class Dunham understood all of this as he watched that flame tank pour fire into the cave position ahead. He'd lost friends to Japanese fire while trying to do with a portable flamethrower what that tank was accomplishing with relative safety. He'd crossed open ground under machine gun fire, felt bullets snap past his head, heard them impact the volcanic ash around his feet. He'd fired his weapon into cave mouths and pillboxes, held the triggers down for the full 8 seconds while Japanese defenders screamed inside, then run back to friendly lines hoping he wouldn't get shot during the withdrawal. He'd survived 3 weeks of that, but he knew his luck wouldn't hold forever. The statistics were clear. The longer you operated a portable flamethrower in combat, the more likely you were to become a casualty. Eventually, a Japanese sniper would get a clear shot. Eventually, a machine gunner would catch you in the open. Eventually, your covering team would be killed or pinned down, unable to provide suppressive fire, and you'd be left to make the attack alone or abandon the mission. The flame tanks changed that equation. They provided the psychological shock and tactical effectiveness of flamethrowers without the catastrophic casualties among operators. They allowed Marines to clear fortified positions that conventional weapons couldn't touch, positions that would otherwise require costly infantry assaults with heavy casualties. They broke Japanese morale in ways that bullets and explosives never could, forcing defenders to evacuate positions they'd sworn to hold to the death. By March 9, 1945, 3 weeks into the Iwo Jima campaign, the flame tanks had become as much a part of Marine tactical doctrine as artillery support or airstrikes. Infantry commanders planning assaults on fortified positions would automatically request flame tank support. The tanks would move forward with the assault, engaging cave positions and pillboxes, while infantry provided security and cleared surrounding areas. The combination was devastatingly effective. Japanese defenders trapped in caves faced an impossible choice when flame tanks appeared. They could remain inside and die from fire, heat, or oxygen deprivation, or they could evacuate and die from rifle fire. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. The human brain, faced with imminent incineration, chose the quick death every time. This wasn't cowardice. This was basic human physiology overriding military training. The Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima numbered approximately 21,000 soldiers at the start of the battle. These weren't ordinary infantry. These were specially selected troops who understood they were being sent to die. Kuribayashi had been explicit in his orders. There would be no relief, no reinforcement, no evacuation. Every man on the island would fight until killed. The troops accepted these orders with the discipline and fatalism that characterized Japanese military culture in 1945. But accepting death in the abstract and facing imminent incineration are two different things. A soldier can make peace with the idea of dying for his country. He can accept that bullets or artillery shells might kill him. He can maintain discipline and continue fighting even when death seems certain. But when flame pours through the entrance of your cave, when the temperature rises past endurance, when you can't breathe because the fire is consuming the oxygen, abstract acceptance means nothing. The body takes over. Survival instinct overrides everything else. This is what the flame tanks exploited. Not just the physical destruction they caused, though that was considerable, but the psychological terror they produced. Japanese soldiers who had proven their courage repeatedly, who had held positions under artillery bombardment that would break most units, who had maintained discipline through weeks of combat in impossible conditions. These same soldiers would evacuate their positions when flame tanks appeared. Marine intelligence officers documented this pattern throughout the campaign. Caves that had withstood sustained conventional attacks would be abandoned within minutes when flame tanks engaged them. Defensive complexes that had required days of costly infantry assaults to reduce would be cleared in hours once flame tanks were committed. The psychological impact was so pronounced that some Japanese units began evacuating positions at night, moving deeper into the tunnel systems to avoid flame tank attacks the next day. This created a new problem for the Americans. Japanese defenders weren't being killed in their positions. They were falling back, consolidating in deeper cave systems, creating new defensive lines farther from the beaches. This prolonged the campaign but also created opportunities. Japanese troops moving through tunnels at night were vulnerable to ambush. Cave entrances they'd abandoned could be sealed by marine engineers, trapping defenders deeper inside the complex. And the withdrawal itself was a victory, proving that American weapons could force Japanese troops to give up positions they'd sworn to hold. The flame tanks also had an impact beyond their immediate tactical effectiveness. Their presence changed how Marines approached fortified positions. Before flame tanks, infantry assaults on caves and pillboxes followed a predictable pattern. Artillery would bombard the position. Infantry would advance under covering fire. They'd get close enough to throw grenades or use demolition charges. Often, they'd need portable flamethrower operators to burn out defenders. The process was slow, costly in casualties, and frequently unsuccessful. With flame tanks available, the process became faster and less costly. Infantry would identify the target and call for tank support. The flame tank would move forward, protected by infantry who prevented Japanese anti-tank teams from getting close. The tank would engage the position from 100 to 150 yards out, well beyond the range where most Japanese anti-tank weapons could be effective. The napalm would pour into the cave or pillbox for as long as necessary, 30 seconds, a minute, sometimes longer for particularly large positions. Then infantry would move in to secure the position and deal with any survivors. Usually, there weren't any. The combination of fire, heat, and oxygen deprivation left few defenders capable of resistance. Those who did survive were often badly burned, disoriented, incapable of coordinated defense. The infantry could clear the position quickly and move on to the next objective. This tactical efficiency meant Marines could advance faster, take fewer casualties, clear more positions in a day than would have been possible with conventional weapons alone. It meant that positions which might have held up an entire battalion for days could be reduced in hours. It meant that the overall campaign, while still brutally costly, was shorter than it would have been without flame tanks. But there was a cost beyond the tactical calculations. The flame tanks forced Americans to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of warfare and the weapons being used to wage it. Burning enemy soldiers alive was effective. It broke Japanese resistance in ways that conventional weapons couldn't. It saved American lives by providing a means to clear fortified positions without costly infantry assaults. But it was also horrific in ways that bullets and explosives weren't. Marines who witnessed flame tank attacks described the sounds of Japanese soldiers screaming inside caves as fire consumed the oxygen. They described the smell of burning flesh that permeated areas where flame weapons had been used extensively. They described finding bodies afterward, sometimes unmarked by fire but dead from oxygen deprivation, sometimes charred beyond recognition. These were experiences that stayed with veterans for the rest of their lives. Private First Class Dunham carried both a portable flamethrower and the memory of what that weapon did to human beings. He'd heard the screams. He'd smelled the burning. He'd seen bodies afterward, some of them barely recognizable as having been human. He understood why the weapon was necessary. He'd watched too many Marines die trying to clear positions with conventional weapons to question the tactical value of flamethrowers. But understanding necessity didn't make the memories easier to carry. The M2-2 flamethrower he operated was a precisely engineered weapon. The fuel mixture was carefully calculated to provide maximum range and burning temperature. The ignition system was designed for reliability in all conditions. The pressure regulators ensured consistent performance. Every component had been tested, refined, improved based on combat experience. The weapon represented the culmination of years of development by the Chemical Warfare Service. But all that engineering, all that careful design, all those improvements, they all served one purpose: to make it easier to burn enemy soldiers alive. That was the uncomfortable truth that flamethrower operators lived with. Their weapon wasn't designed to destroy equipment or fortifications. It was designed to kill people, specifically, in one of the most horrific ways imaginable. The Chemical Warfare Service tried to reframe this reality. In 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Orby Bostick published an article in the Chemical Warfare Bulletin titled "Mercy Killer: Instant Death from the Flamethrower." Bostick argued that flamethrowers caused instant death through profound shock to the nervous system. He claimed that victims lost consciousness immediately and died without prolonged suffering. This characterization was based on observations of bodies recovered after flame attacks, many of which showed minimal external burns. The conclusion was that death had occurred rapidly from oxygen deprivation or carbon monoxide poisoning rather than from burns. Therefore, the reasoning went, flamethrowers were actually more humane than being shot or blown apart by explosives. A bullet could leave you dying slowly from internal injuries. An artillery shell could leave you dismembered but alive. But a flamethrower, according to Bostick, killed so quickly that victims never suffered. This analysis was fundamentally wrong, and subsequent medical studies proved it. The terror of flamethrowers wasn't about how death occurred. It was about knowing you were about to burn alive and having seconds to process that knowledge. A bullet kills before you understand what's happening. An explosion destroys consciousness instantly, but fire gives you time to know you're dying. That knowledge, those few seconds of absolute terror, was what broke Japanese morale. The medical corps studies conducted later in 1945 examined bodies recovered from caves that had been attacked with flamethrowers. They found evidence of severe inhalation injuries, toxic gas poisoning, thermal damage to airways, and oxygen deprivation. Many victims had died not from external burns, but from respiratory failure caused by inhaling superheated gases and combustion byproducts. These deaths weren't instant. They took minutes, during which the victim remained conscious, unable to breathe, experiencing temperatures well above what human tissue can tolerate. The Chemical Warfare Service's characterization of flamethrowers as mercy killers was subsequently disproven by these more detailed studies. But by then, the weapon had already demonstrated its psychological effectiveness in combat. The misunderstanding about how it worked didn't change the fact that it worked. Japanese soldiers feared flamethrowers more than any other American weapon. That fear, that psychological vulnerability, was more valuable than any amount of physical destruction. This is what made the flame tanks so devastating. They combined the psychological terror of fire with the physical impossibility of escape. When a portable flamethrower operator attacked a cave, defenders could often evacuate through rear exits before the flames reached them. The 40-yard range of the portable unit meant the operator had to get close, giving defenders warning. The short burn time, 8 to 9 seconds, meant defenders had time to retreat deeper into the cave system. But flame tanks changed that calculus. The 150-yard range meant tanks could engage caves from positions that gave defenders less warning. The massive fuel capacity meant tanks could sustain attacks for minutes at a time, pouring hundreds of gallons of napalm into cave systems. Defenders couldn't retreat fast enough. The flames would follow them through the tunnels, consuming oxygen throughout the complex, filling every connected space with heat and toxic gases. In large cave systems with multiple chambers and connecting tunnels, a single flame tank attack could render the entire complex uninhabitable. Defenders in chambers that weren't directly hit would still die from oxygen deprivation as fire consumed the available air. Those who tried to evacuate through rear entrances would emerge into marine rifle fire. Those who stayed inside would suffocate or burn. There were no good options, no way to survive, no possibility of continuing resistance. This tactical reality forced Japanese commanders to make difficult decisions. They could keep troops in forward cave positions where they were vulnerable to flame tank attacks, or they could pull troops back to deeper positions that were harder for flame tanks to reach, but also less tactically valuable. Either choice represented a defeat. Either choice meant abandoning positions that had been prepared specifically to stop the American advance. Kuribayashi had planned for American firepower superiority. He'd designed his defenses to survive artillery, naval bombardment, and aerial bombing. He'd positioned his forces to inflict maximum casualties on attacking infantry. He'd created a defensive network that should have held the Americans at bay for months, but he hadn't planned for flame tanks. He couldn't have. The weapon was too new, too recently developed, too different from anything Japanese forces had encountered before. By mid-March, 3 weeks into the campaign, Kuribayashi understood that his defensive strategy was failing. Not because his troops lacked courage or discipline, not because his fortifications were inadequate, but because American flame tanks had found a way to make fortifications irrelevant. Caves and pillboxes that should have protected his troops were becoming death traps. Positions that should have required weeks of American effort to reduce were falling in days. Kuribayashi sent reports to Tokyo describing the effectiveness of American flame weapons. He requested anti-tank guns, more ammunition for existing anti-tank weapons, anything that might allow his troops to destroy flame tanks before they could engage defensive positions. But by March 1945, Japan had few resources to spare for Iwo Jima. The garrison was on its own, fighting with whatever weapons and ammunition remained after 3 weeks of intensive combat. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The flame tanks continued their work. Day after day, they moved forward with Marine infantry assaults, engaging cave positions and pillboxes, breaking Japanese resistance through psychological terror as much as physical destruction. The statistics told the story. On Iwo Jima, more than 30% of all Japanese killed died not from bullets or explosives, but from being incinerated alive by flamethrowers, either portable units or flame tanks. Over the 36-day campaign, Marines used 360,000 gallons of flamethrower fuel, 10,000 gallons per day on average, though usage varied depending on the intensity of fighting and the number of fortified positions being engaged. Private First Class Dunham survived the Iwo Jima campaign, one of the relative few portable flamethrower operators who made it through the entire battle without being killed or wounded. His survival was due partly to skill, partly to the courage of his covering teams, and partly to luck. But it was also due to the flame tanks. Every time a flame tank cleared a cave complex, that was one less mission for portable flamethrower operators. Every position the tanks reduced was one less time Dunham had to cross open ground under fire with 68 pounds of explosive fuel on his back. The Battle of Iwo Jima lasted 36 days, from February 19th through March 26th, 1945. The American invasion force consisted of approximately 70,000 Marines from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, plus supporting Navy and Army units. American forces suffered over 26,000 casualties during the campaign. Approximately 7,000 Americans were killed in action or died of wounds. Another 19,000 were wounded, but survived. The casualty rate exceeded 30%, making Iwo Jima one of the costliest battles in Marine Corps history, measured by percentage of forces engaged. Japanese casualties were catastrophic. Of the estimated 21,000 Japanese soldiers on the island at the beginning of the battle, only 216 were taken prisoner. Some of these prisoners had been knocked unconscious or were too severely wounded to resist capture. The rest, more than 20,000 men, were killed in action. Some died defending their positions. Some died in sealed caves when Marines used demolitions or bulldozers to close off the entrances. Some chose suicide rather than surrender. The Japanese casualty rate exceeded 98%. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the Japanese commander, was killed during the final days of organized resistance. His body was never identified among the thousands of Japanese dead scattered across the island. The exact circumstances of his death remain unclear. Some accounts suggest he led a final banzai charge. Others indicate he committed suicide in his command bunker. What's certain is that by late March 1945, the defensive strategy he'd spent 8 months preparing had been broken by a combination of American firepower, Marine Corps determination, and the psychological terror of flame weapons. The butcher's bill at Iwo Jima shocked American military planners and the public. This was the only major Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties in absolute numbers, though Japanese deaths far outnumbered American deaths. 7,000 Americans killed, 26,000 total casualties for an island 8 square miles in size. The numbers forced difficult questions about the cost of future operations. If 36 days of fighting on a tiny volcanic island killed 7,000 Americans, how many would die in the months or years required to conquer Japan itself? The Japanese home islands covered 145,000 square miles. The population was 70 million people. Japanese military forces still numbered several million men, most of them deployed in defensive positions throughout the home islands, China, and other occupied territories. An invasion of Japan would make Iwo Jima look small by comparison. These casualty projections influenced American strategic planning for the rest of the war. Military planners began calculating what it would take to invade Japan. The estimates were staggering: hundreds of thousands of American casualties, possibly over 1 million. Years of fighting to secure the home islands. Fanatical resistance from not just military forces but civilian populations armed with bamboo spears and Molotov cocktails. The prospect was nightmarish. Flame weapons figured prominently in the invasion plans. If flamethrowers had been so effective at breaking Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima, they would be even more critical in Japan itself. The invasion plan called for massive deployment of flame weapons. Every Marine division would have increased flamethrower support. Flame tank production was accelerated. The plan called for producing thousands of additional portable flamethrowers and hundreds more flame tanks before the invasion began. Chemical warfare service production facilities went to maximum capacity. The Seabees at Schofield Barracks, who'd built the flame tanks used on Iwo Jima, received orders to produce 72 more tanks for the Marine Corps alone. Additional orders came from Army units that had seen flame tanks in action and wanted their own. By June 1945, Colonel Unmarked's flamethrower group had produced 354 flame tanks total, with more on order. The logic was straightforward. If flame weapons could break Japanese resistance on small islands, they could break resistance on the home islands. The psychological advantage was too significant to ignore. Japanese soldiers had proven they would fight to the death when defending fortified positions, but they would also evacuate those positions when flame tanks appeared. That behavioral pattern, that psychological vulnerability, represented a way to reduce American casualties during the invasion. Operation Downfall, as the invasion plan was called, assumed Japanese resistance on the home islands would exceed anything seen on Iwo Jima or Okinawa. The defenders would fight on their own soil, protecting their families, facing what they believed would be the extermination of their race and culture. They would have prepared defensive positions for months or years. They would have stockpiled ammunition and supplies. They would fight with the desperation of people who believed they had nothing to lose. Against that level of resistance, conventional weapons alone might not be enough, but flame weapons, particularly flame tanks, had proven they could break even the most determined defenders. The psychological terror they produced, the primal fear of burning alive, these were more powerful than training or discipline or cultural conditioning. The invasion plan incorporated this understanding. Flame tanks would lead assaults on fortified positions. Portable flamethrowers would clear buildings and caves. The invasion of Japan would be accompanied by fire on a scale never before seen in warfare. Operation Downfall never happened. Japan surrendered in August 1945 after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The flame weapons stockpiled for the invasion were never used in Japan. Most were eventually scrapped. The Americans kept using flamethrowers in Korea and Vietnam, but never again on the scale planned for the invasion of Japan. The weapon remained in the arsenal, but its moment had passed. The atomic bombs that ended the war represented a different kind of fire, one that made conventional flame weapons seem almost quaint by comparison. But the psychological principle remained the same. Japanese military and civilian leaders understood that resistance was futile when faced with weapons that could destroy entire cities in seconds. The terror produced by atomic weapons was different in scale, but similar in kind to the terror produced by flamethrowers. Both exploited the human fear of burning. Both demonstrated that some weapons break morale as much through psychological impact as through physical destruction. Private First Class Dunham shipped out from Iwo Jima in early April 1945. He'd survived 36 days of combat with a weapon that most operators didn't survive more than a few missions using. His portable flamethrower had cleared dozens of Japanese positions. He'd burned out pillboxes and caves, killed enemy soldiers in ways that would haunt him for decades. But he'd also saved American lives by providing a means to clear fortified positions without costly infantry assaults. He carried his M2-2 flamethrower back to the transport ship that would take him to Hawaii. The weapon weighed the same as when he'd landed, 68 pounds fully loaded. But it felt heavier now. The weight wasn't just physical. It was the accumulated burden of 36 days, using fire as a weapon, of hearing screams from inside caves as flames consumed oxygen, of smelling burning flesh, of knowing that the weapon on his back existed for one purpose: to burn human beings alive. In Hawaii, Dunham was assigned to train new flamethrower operators. The Marine Corps needed more operators for the planned invasion of Japan. Men had to be taught how to use the M2-2, how to approach targets under fire, how to coordinate with covering teams, how to survive long enough to complete their missions. Dunham taught these skills with the authority of someone who'd used the weapon in combat and lived to tell about it. But he also taught lessons that weren't in the training manuals. He taught that flamethrower operators had life expectancies measured in minutes once combat began. He taught that covering teams were just as likely to die as the operators they were protecting. He taught that the weapon they carried made them the highest priority targets on any battlefield. And he taught that using a flamethrower changed you in ways that had nothing to do with tactical effectiveness or casualty rates. The young Marines he trained in Hawaii never used their flamethrowers in combat. Japan surrendered before the invasion began. The flame tanks being built for Operation Downfall sat unused in depots. The massive deployment of flame weapons planned for the home islands never materialized. The war ended with fire, but atomic fire rather than napalm fire. The distinction mattered strategically, but not psychologically. Both weapons exploited the same fundamental human fear. After the war, Japanese veterans were interviewed by American intelligence officers. Many stated that flamethrowers had been the weapon they feared most, more than aerial bombing, more than naval artillery, more than tanks or infantry assaults. The reason was simple and consistent across hundreds of interviews. Flamethrowers meant certain death in an enclosed space. A soldier in a bunker could survive artillery. Concrete provided protection. A soldier in a bunker could survive tank fire. Steel plate could deflect shells. But a soldier in a bunker couldn't survive fire. Fire consumed the oxygen. Fire filled the space with heat and toxic gas. Fire gave you seconds to decide between burning to death inside or running into machine gun fire outside. Both choices led to death, but one was instant, while the other meant burning alive. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Human physiology made the decision. The body chose the quick death over the slow one every single time, regardless of what the mind might believe about duty or honor or dying for the emperor. This psychological vulnerability was what made flame weapons so effective. Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima had proven they could accept death. They'd held positions under artillery bombardment that would have broken most units. They'd maintained discipline through weeks of combat in impossible conditions. They'd fought with courage that even their enemies acknowledged. But courage meant nothing when faced with fire in an enclosed space. Training meant nothing. Discipline meant nothing. Cultural conditioning about the shame of surrender meant nothing. The body took over and chose survival, even when survival meant running into certain death from bullets rather than possible death from fire. The Americans understood this psychological dynamic and exploited it ruthlessly. Flame tanks became the primary method for reducing fortified positions on Iwo Jima precisely because they produced this psychological collapse. A conventional tank attack might force Japanese defenders to retreat temporarily, but they'd often reoccupy the position once the tank withdrew. A flame tank attack left positions abandoned permanently. The defenders would rather give up carefully prepared fortifications than face fire again. This wasn't cowardice on the part of Japanese defenders. It was basic human biology overriding military training. Every human being carries the same evolutionary inheritance: fear of fire, fear of burning, fear of suffocation. These fears are older than civilization, older than warfare, older than any military culture's codes of conduct. When fire attacks trigger these fears, the response is automatic and overwhelming. The flame tanks on Iwo Jima didn't just kill Japanese soldiers. They broke the psychological foundation that Japanese defensive strategy depended on. Kuribayashi's plan required troops to hold fortified positions regardless of casualties, to accept death rather than retreat, to maintain discipline even when their situation became hopeless. The plan worked against conventional weapons. Artillery could kill individual soldiers, but survivors would remain in position. Infantry assaults could be repelled with concentrated fire. Tank attacks could be countered with anti-tank weapons or accepted as a cost of defensive warfare. But flame tanks attacked the psychological assumptions underlying the entire defensive strategy. When positions became death traps rather than protective fortifications, when holding ground meant certain death by incineration rather than possible death by conventional weapons, when the choice was between burning alive or retreating, discipline couldn't hold. The troops evacuated. The defensive lines collapsed. The carefully prepared positions were abandoned. Not because the defenders lacked courage, but because human beings cannot override the instinct to escape fire. By late March 1945, this pattern had repeated across Iwo Jima. Cave after cave, pillbox after pillbox, defensive position after defensive position, all cleared by flame tanks or portable flamethrowers. The Japanese garrison that should have held out for months was broken in 36 days, not primarily through superior firepower, though the Americans certainly had that, not primarily through tactical superiority, though Marine Corps doctrine was excellent, but primarily through psychological warfare conducted with flame weapons that exploited fundamental human fears. The extraordinary courage displayed on Iwo Jima resulted in an unprecedented number of Medal of Honor awards. 27 medals were awarded for actions during the campaign, the largest number for any single battle in American military history. 13 recipients survived to receive the decoration from President Truman. 14 were awarded posthumously to men who died performing the actions that earned the medal. 12 of the 27 medals were awarded specifically for actions involving the elimination of enemy positions, often using flamethrowers or supporting flamethrower operations. The medals recognized individual acts of heroism, but they also represented something larger. They represented the cost of breaking Japanese defensive positions on Iwo Jima. Each medal told a story of Marines who approached fortified positions under fire, who cleared caves and pillboxes that conventional weapons couldn't touch, who died or were wounded completing missions that saved other Marines' lives. Many of these stories involved flamethrowers, either portable units or flame tanks, because flamethrowers were the weapon that made breaking fortified positions possible. Corporal Herschel Woody Williams, who received the Medal of Honor for clearing 7 pillboxes on Iwo Jima using a portable flamethrower, later said the medal didn't belong to him. It belonged to the men who died protecting him. His covering team had been killed providing suppressive fire while he approached Japanese positions. He'd survived and received recognition. They'd died and been buried with thousands of other Marines whose individual heroism went unrecognized except by the men who served beside them. Williams wore his Medal of Honor for 77 years. From 1945 until his death in 2022, he became the last surviving World War II Medal of Honor recipient, and throughout those decades, he maintained that the medal represented not his courage, but the sacrifice of Marines who died, so that he could complete his mission. He visited the graves of his covering team when their names were finally identified decades later. He spoke their names in interviews and speeches. He made sure everyone understood that his survival had cost other men their lives. This was the true cost of flame weapons on Iwo Jima. Not just the Japanese soldiers who died by fire, though their deaths were horrific. Not just the flamethrower operators who were killed carrying their weapons, though their casualties were catastrophic, but the entire ecosystem of sacrifice that flame weapons required. The covering teams who died providing suppressive fire, the infantry who protected flame tanks from anti-tank teams, the tank crews who operated flame tanks knowing they were priority targets, The Marines who cleared positions after flamethrowers had done their work, dealing with the aftermath of what fire did to human beings. The Battle of Iwo Jima was the bloodiest in Marine Corps history, measured by percentage of forces engaged. It was the only major Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties in absolute numbers. It was a campaign where courage and sacrifice were displayed on both sides, to a degree that even veterans of other Pacific battles found remarkable. And it was a campaign where flame weapons, particularly flame tanks, proved to be the decisive factor in breaking Japanese resistance. The lessons learned on Iwo Jima influenced American planning for the rest of the war and for conflicts that followed. Flame weapons became standard equipment for Marine Corps and Army units engaged in reducing fortified positions. The tactics developed for coordinating flame tanks with infantry were refined and incorporated into doctrine. The psychological understanding of how fire breaks defensive morale became part of how American forces approached warfare against entrenched enemies. But Iwo Jima also represented the peak of flame weapon usage in American military history. Never again would flamethrowers be deployed on such a scale or with such devastating effect. Korea saw flame tanks used extensively in the early phases of the war, but the conflict quickly became one of mobility rather than fortified positions. Vietnam saw flamethrowers used to clear tunnels and bunkers, but the nature of counterinsurgency warfare limited their tactical utility. By 1978, flamethrowers were removed from the American military arsenal entirely. The weapons were deemed inhumane, violations of international norms about acceptable methods of warfare. The psychological terror they produced, the horrific nature of death by burning, the images of flamethrower attacks that had shocked even wartime audiences, all of these contributed to the decision to retire the weapons permanently. But for one crucial period in World War II, flame weapons were the answer to an impossible tactical problem. How do you break an enemy who's willing to die defending fortified positions? How do you reduce casualties among your own forces while clearing defenses that conventional weapons can't touch? How do you defeat an enemy whose courage and discipline are unquestionable? The answer, at least on Iwo Jima, was fire. Fire projected 150 yards from armored tanks, fire that consumed oxygen in enclosed spaces, fire that exploited primal human fears that no amount of training could overcome. Private First Class Robert Dunham carried his memories of Iwo Jima for the rest of his life. He'd survived when most flamethrower operators didn't. He'd used his weapons successfully when many operators were killed before they could complete their missions. He'd trained other Marines to use flamethrowers who never had to use them in combat. He'd witnessed the introduction of flame tanks and seen how they changed the nature of warfare on fortified islands. But he also carried the burden of what those weapons did. The screams from inside caves, the smell of burning flesh, the bodies found afterward, some unmarked by fire but dead from oxygen deprivation, some burned beyond recognition. The knowledge that his weapon existed for one purpose, to exploit the most primal human fear in order to kill enemy soldiers in one of the most horrific ways imaginable. This was the psychological cost of flame weapons that the Chemical Warfare Service never adequately addressed. They could engineer better ignition systems, improve fuel mixtures, increase range and reliability. They could produce training manuals and tactical doctrine. They could calculate casualty rates and measure tactical effectiveness. But they couldn't address the fundamental moral and psychological burden that came with using fire as a weapon against human beings. The flame tanks solved the tactical problem of how to reduce fortified positions without catastrophic casualties among attacking forces. They solved the engineering problem of how to project flame at long range with adequate fuel capacity. They solved the protection problem of how to keep operators safe from enemy fire. But they didn't solve, and couldn't solve, the human problem of what it meant to use such weapons, what it cost psychologically to watch them work, what memories they created for the people who witnessed their effects. The cave systems on Iwo Jima told their own story long after the battle ended. Marine engineers and demolition teams spent weeks after organized resistance ceased, exploring tunnels and chambers, mapping the extent of Japanese defensive preparations. What they found was extraordinary. The 11 miles of tunnels that intelligence had estimated was actually closer to 18 miles of interconnected passages, chambers, and defensive positions. Some tunnels descended 5 stories deep into the volcanic rock. Some chambers could hold hundreds of men with stockpiles of ammunition, food, and water sufficient for months of resistance. The Japanese had built an underground fortress specifically designed to defeat American firepower. They'd learned from previous battles in the Marshall Islands and Marianas that surface fortifications, no matter how well constructed, couldn't survive sustained naval bombardment and aerial attack, so they went underground, carving defensive positions deep enough that even 16-inch naval shells couldn't reach them. They created a defensive network where troops could move between positions through tunnels, where they could retreat from surface attacks and return once the bombardment ended, where they could hold out indefinitely against conventional assault. The strategy should have worked. The fortifications were extraordinary. The Japanese garrison was well-trained and highly motivated. The defensive positions provided excellent observation and fields of fire. Everything favored the defenders. Everything except one factor that Kuribayashi couldn't have anticipated: the psychological impact of flame weapons deployed at a scale never before seen in warfare. Marine engineers exploring the cave systems after the battle found evidence of this impact everywhere. Positions that should have been occupied were abandoned. Equipment and supplies were left behind as defenders evacuated. Bodies were found in tunnel sections far from any entrance, suggesting defenders had died trying to escape deeper into the complex when flames consumed the oxygen in forward chambers. The physical evidence told a story that after-action reports confirmed. Flame weapons had broken the defensive strategy by making fortifications uninhabitable. In some caves, engineers found Japanese soldiers who had survived the initial flame attacks but died days or weeks later from injuries, starvation, or oxygen deprivation in sealed sections of the tunnel complex. These men had retreated so deep into the caves that they couldn't find their way out. Some had written final letters or diary entries describing their situation. They knew they were going to die. They knew the Americans controlled the surface. They knew their defensive positions had been overrun, but they stayed in the darkness rather than surrender, choosing slow death by starvation over capture. The psychological impact of flame weapons extended beyond the immediate terror of the attack itself. Defenders who survived flame attacks and retreated deeper into tunnel systems carried the memory of what they'd experienced. They'd felt the heat building as flames consumed oxygen. They'd heard comrades screaming. They'd smelled burning flesh. When flame tanks appeared again, when the distinctive sound of napalm igniting reached them through the tunnels, they evacuated even faster. The psychological conditioning was complete. Fire meant death, and the only response was flight. This created a cascading effect throughout the defensive network. Positions that hadn't been directly attacked by flame weapons would be abandoned because defenders feared they'd be next. Japanese troops consolidated in deeper positions, giving up carefully prepared forward defenses to avoid flame attacks. The withdrawal created gaps in the defensive line that Marines exploited. What should have been weeks of fighting to reduce each position became days as defenders chose retreat over facing flames again. By the final week of March 1945, organized Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima had collapsed. Small groups continued fighting, some for weeks after the island was declared secure, but the coordinated defensive strategy that Kuribayashi had designed was broken. The psychological foundation of that strategy, troops willing to die in place rather than retreat, had been shattered by flame weapons that made dying in place too horrific to accept. The final toll on Iwo Jima reflected the brutal nature of the fighting. 7,000 Americans killed, 19,000 wounded, over 20,000 Japanese dead, only 216 prisoners taken. The casualty rates on both sides exceeded anything seen in previous Pacific battles, but the tactical lessons were equally clear. Flame weapons, particularly flame tanks, were the decisive factor in breaking fortified defenses when defenders were willing to accept death rather than surrender. These lessons influenced not just future Pacific operations, but the broader strategic thinking about how to defeat Japan. American planners understood that the home islands would be defended with the same fanaticism seen on Iwo Jima. They understood that Japanese forces would fortify cities, mountains, and coastal areas with the same thoroughness that Kuribayashi had fortified Iwo Jima. They understood that conventional weapons alone might not be sufficient to break such defenses without catastrophic American casualties. The solution, as conceived in the spring of 1945, was massive deployment of flame weapons. Not just hundreds of flame tanks, but thousands. Not just flamethrowers for specialized units, but flamethrowers integrated into standard infantry equipment. The invasion of Japan would be accompanied by fire on a scale that would make Iwo Jima look small by comparison. Every cave, every bunker, every fortified building would face flames. The psychological terror that had broken Japanese resistance on an 8-square-mile island would be deployed across the entire home islands. This planning reflected a dark understanding about modern warfare. The most effective weapons aren't always the ones that kill most efficiently. Sometimes the most effective weapons are the ones that break the enemy's will to fight. Flame weapons did both. They killed effectively by consuming oxygen in enclosed spaces. But more importantly, they broke defensive morale by exploiting primal human fears that transcended training, discipline, or cultural conditioning. The atomic bombs that ended the war in August 1945 represented a different approach to the same problem. Instead of breaking Japanese resistance position by position, cave by cave, city by city, the atomic bombs demonstrated that continued resistance was futile. The psychological message was similar to what flame weapons conveyed. Some weapons produced terror beyond what human beings can accept. The difference was scale. Flame weapons produced terror among soldiers in immediate contact with them. Atomic weapons produced terror among entire populations, military and civilian alike. Private First Class Dunham was in Hawaii training new flamethrower operators when news of Japan's surrender reached him. His first reaction was relief. The invasion he'd been preparing for, the operation that would have required thousands of flamethrower operators and produced casualties that would make Iwo Jima look small, wasn't going to happen. The war was over. He'd survived. He could go home. His second reaction was more complex. The atomic bombs that ended the war had killed tens of thousands of Japanese civilians in seconds. The destruction was total, the death toll staggering, the implications for future warfare almost incomprehensible. But Dunham understood, in a way that many Americans couldn't, why those bombs had been necessary. He'd seen what it took to break Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima. He'd witnessed the casualties required to secure 8 square miles of volcanic rock. He understood that conquering the home islands using conventional weapons would have required years of fighting and produced casualties on both sides that would have dwarfed anything seen in the Pacific War. The flame weapons he'd carried and operated represented one approach to that problem. Break resistance position by position through psychological terror, combined with physical destruction. The atomic bombs represented a different approach. Demonstrate that resistance itself was futile, that continued fighting would lead only to annihilation. Both approaches exploited fear. Both approaches produced horrific casualties. Both approaches raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of modern warfare and the weapons being used to wage it. Dunham shipped home to Nebraska in October 1945. He carried his service records, his combat decorations, and memories that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The M2O-2 flamethrower he'd operated on Iwo Jima stayed in Hawaii, assigned to training units that would prepare troops for conflicts that hadn't happened yet. The weapon itself would continue in service for decades, seeing combat in Korea and Vietnam before finally being retired in the late 1970s. But the psychological lessons learned on Iwo Jima, the understanding of how flame weapons break defensive morale, those lessons remained relevant long after the weapons themselves were retired. Military planners in every major armed force studied what happened on Iwo Jima. They analyzed how flame weapons had broken Japanese resistance. They incorporated those lessons into doctrine about how to reduce fortified positions, how to exploit psychological vulnerabilities, how to use weapons that terrify as much as they destroy. The flame tanks that had been so effective on Iwo Jima represented a specific solution to a specific problem. How do you break an enemy defending fortified positions when that enemy has proven willing to accept death rather than surrender? The answer was a weapon that made death too horrible to accept, that exploited fears too primal to overcome, that turned fortifications into death traps rather than protective positions. This understanding about psychological warfare and weapons that exploit primal fears influenced military thinking for generations, not just in terms of specific weapons, but in terms of broader strategy. How do you defeat an enemy whose morale and discipline are unquestionable? Not through superior firepower alone, though that helps. Not through better tactics alone, though those matter. But through weapons and methods that attack the psychological foundations of enemy resistance, that exploit vulnerabilities that no amount of training can eliminate, that produce terror beyond what human beings can accept. The flame tanks on Iwo Jima did exactly that. They projected fire 150 yards into caves and bunkers. They consumed oxygen in enclosed spaces. They produced temperatures that human tissue couldn't tolerate. They created conditions where staying in defensive positions meant certain death by incineration. And they forced defenders to make impossible choices, burn alive inside or run into certain death outside. Most defenders chose to run, not because they lacked courage, but because human biology overrode military training. The body's survival instinct, faced with imminent incineration, chose flight over fortitude. This wasn't a failure of discipline or courage. This was basic human physiology, responding to a threat that evolution had programmed all humans to fear above almost all others. Japanese veterans interviewed after the war consistently described flamethrowers as the weapon they feared most. Not because flamethrowers killed most efficiently, artillery and aerial bombing killed far more Japanese soldiers than flamethrowers did, but because flamethrowers produced death in a way that was impossible to accept psychologically. A soldier could make peace with dying from a bullet or shell fragment. Death would be quick, possibly even honorable, but death from fire meant burning alive, meant seconds or minutes of agony, meant experiencing the one thing human beings are evolutionarily programmed to fear most. This psychological vulnerability was what made flame weapons so effective on Iwo Jima. The physical destruction they caused was significant, but not decisive. 360,000 gallons of flamethrower fuel burned over 36 days. That's a lot of fuel, but conventional explosives delivered far more total destructive energy to Japanese positions. What made flame weapons decisive wasn't the destruction they caused, but the terror they produced, and the behavioral changes that terror created in Japanese defenders. Positions were abandoned not because they'd been destroyed, but because they'd become psychologically uninhabitable. Defenders evacuated not because they'd taken casualties, but because they couldn't face fire again. Defensive lines collapsed not because they'd been breached by conventional assault, but because troops chose retreat over facing flames. The weapon's effectiveness was measured not in bodies burned, but in positions abandoned, morale broken, and resistance shattered. This is the uncomfortable truth about flame weapons on Iwo Jima. They worked not primarily through physical destruction, but through psychological terror. They exploited primal human fears to break an enemy whose courage and discipline were otherwise unquestionable. They demonstrated that even the most determined defenders have psychological vulnerabilities that the right weapons can exploit. And they proved that, in modern warfare, breaking the enemy's will to fight is often more important than destroying the enemy's ability to fight. The 12 flame tanks that saw action on Iwo Jima were maintained and used in subsequent operations. Some went to Okinawa, where they proved equally effective against Japanese cave defenses. Some remained in Marine Corps service through the Korean War, where they were used against North Korean and Chinese positions. The lessons learned operating these tanks, the tactics developed coordinating them with infantry, the understanding of their psychological impact, all of this remained relevant for decades. But the specific conditions that made flame tanks so decisive on Iwo Jima were never quite replicated. Future conflicts involved more mobile warfare, less emphasis on fortified positions, different tactical situations. Flame weapons remained useful in specific circumstances, particularly for clearing bunkers and tunnels, but they never again played such a central role in breaking enemy resistance as they did during those 36 days on Iwo Jima. The portable flamethrower operators who survived Iwo Jima, men like Private First Class Dunham, carried memories that shaped the rest of their lives. They'd used weapons that produced death in ways they'd never imagined before the war. They'd heard the screams. They'd smelled the burning. They'd seen the bodies. They understood, in ways that people who hadn't been there couldn't fully grasp, what fire does to human beings, and what using fire as a weapon does to the people who wield it. Many of these veterans struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares about the caves on Iwo Jima, about the screams, about the flames. They avoided situations that reminded them of their combat experiences. They had difficulty talking about what they'd done, even with family members who wanted to understand. The psychological cost of using flame weapons wasn't something the Chemical Warfare Service had prepared them for, and it wasn't something post-war society understood how to address. Some veterans found ways to process their experiences. They joined veterans' organizations, talked with others who'd been there, found community with people who understood what they'd witnessed. Some found meaning through service, dedicating their lives to helping other veterans, or ensuring that the sacrifices of the war weren't forgotten. Some simply lived with their memories, carrying the burden privately, never fully articulating what using a flamethrower on Iwo Jima had meant. But all of them understood something profound about warfare that people who hadn't been there couldn't fully grasp. That the most effective weapons aren't always the ones that destroy most efficiently, that psychological impact matters as much as physical destruction, that exploiting human fears can break resistance that conventional weapons can't touch, and that using such weapons comes with psychological costs that endure long after the physical wounds have healed. The Battle of Iwo Jima ended on March 26, 1945, with the island declared secure. But for the veterans who'd fought there, particularly those who'd operated flame weapons or witnessed their effects, the battle never completely ended. The memories remained. The questions remained. The understanding of what modern warfare had become remained. Those flame tanks projecting fire 150 yards into Japanese caves represented something new in warfare. Not just a technological achievement, though the engineering was impressive. Not just a tactical innovation, though the doctrine for using them was well developed, but a deliberate exploitation of primal human psychology to break enemy resistance. The weapons worked not primarily through physical destruction, but through terror. Not primarily by killing defenders, but by forcing them to abandon positions they'd sworn to hold to the death. This was the true lesson of flame weapons on Iwo Jima. In modern warfare, psychological vulnerabilities matter as much as physical ones. Weapons that exploit primal fears can break resistance that conventional weapons cannot. And the most determined enemy, the most courageous defenders, the most disciplined troops, all have psychological limits that the right weapons can exceed. Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima proved they could withstand artillery, aerial bombing, naval gunfire, tank attacks, and infantry assaults. They proved they could accept death rather than surrender. They proved they could maintain discipline under conditions that would break most military units. But they couldn't withstand fire projected 150 yards into the caves where they'd taken shelter. They couldn't override the instinct to flee when flames consumed the oxygen they needed to breathe. They couldn't accept burning alive when running into bullets offered a quicker death. This wasn't a failure of courage or discipline. This was human biology responding to a threat that evolution had programmed all humans to fear. The flame tanks on Iwo Jima didn't defeat Japanese courage. They exploited human physiology. They attacked the limbic system, the ancient parts of the brain that control survival instincts, the parts that react before conscious thought can intervene. The veterans who operated those weapons, who witnessed their effects, who understood what they meant, carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives. They knew that modern warfare had found ways to exploit the deepest human fears. They knew that weapons existed that could break resistance by attacking not the body but the mind, not physical capability, but psychological endurance. They knew that fire, humanity's oldest tool, had become humanity's most psychologically devastating weapon. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.